Trying to make more sense of your family business? Let's talk about it.
Welcome to another episode of Making Sense of Family Business. I'm John Kenfield, the Family Business Solutionist, broadcasting from Melbourne in Australia. Today I'm talking about parenting styles and the impact they have on family culture and the development of the personalities of next generation family members. Why? Because although we don't talk much about it, the style of parenting has a lot to do with the way children develop, grow up, build relationships, develop resilience, have coping skills and the like, which if you're daft or game enough to put them together in a family business somewhere further down the track, could end up leading into a world of pain. And it could just as well lead to an unstoppably successful business. In my work, it's often very clear that stuff that happened, the emotional traumas that were suffered back in the playroom, play out in a family business forum which has been weaponized for the purpose, consciously or unconsciously, sometimes 30, 40, 50 years later. So let's just explore what we mean from a lay perspective by parenting styles, because if we understand the things that have happened in the past that maybe we could or would have done differently had we known better or had we had more time, if we understand the impact they've had, it changes the way we approach current situations and deal with things like current conflicts. It's all well and good from the perspective of being 30, 40, 50 years down the track to think we could and should have done things differently when our kids were small and we were trying to get this business off the ground. The reality is sheer business survival, and therefore economic survival of the family, relied on the parents putting heart and soul into running the business, and sometimes that had an impact on the way they were able to parent their children. What we do know is that from the very earliest ages, children are totally dependent on their parents until they develop increasing amounts of self-sufficiency. In the early years, parents provide the basic protections to enable children to survive. Then they start educating them in things like language, communication, social behaviours, relationship management, all of those things. And depending on the model provided by the parents, most children will have their personalities quite powerfully shaped because the parental style forms the bedrock of the family's culture. Now, there are a number of different areas of development of the human psyche. There's executive reasoning, there's personality development, and there's emotional maturity. All three of those develop at different speeds with very rapid development in the very early years, and then different forms of development for the different streams as children get older. Most of them end up sort of culminating in reasonable level of maturity somewhere in the mid-20s. But it may be that children develop for, it may be neurodevelopmental reasons, genetics, prenatal issues, it may be chemical imbalances, and it can simply be environmental conditioning. They develop along those three tracks at different rates, in different speeds, in different ways. So they may be perfectly well developed in one dimension, but underdeveloped or misdeveloped in other dimensions. And the style of parenting can have a lot to do with that. Now, the psychs suggest there are four main styles of parenting. Few parents would be exclusively one or another, but this gives us some opportunity to understand what's going on. The gold medal style of parenting is called authoritative. And it is a high warmth, high structure, medium control sort of model where the parents give clear authoritative guidelines to the kids, they establish boundaries, they explain the rules of social interaction and expectations, and they have consequences for misbehaviours, they recognise successes, they don't ignore failures, and they tend to be quite a good model for developing a rounded personality. So this is a very engaged parenting model, one or both parents, highly engaged, good emotional connection, high empathy, plenty of structure, a fair degree of control when the kids are little and need it, and increasingly less control as they grow older and more capable themselves. The second model is called authoritarian, and this is low warmth and high control. So the authoritarian parents are strict, they have lots of rules, they expect more or less unquestioning obedience to the rules. They don't necessarily allow the children to do an awful lot of use of their own initiative to work things out for themselves. They certainly set clear boundaries. A lot of children will grow up with a high degree of dependence on being told what to do. Others will grow up very rebellious and pushing back against the parents, and that can become quite destructive. There's not a lot of structure in the authoritarian household because a lot of the rules tend to be not part of a particular code. They are more or less made up on the spot, often as an extension of what parents feel they should be doing, rather than because it's been an entirely worked out system. The third type is the permissive parent, which has high warmth and low control. So as opposed to the authoritarian, which has high control, permissive parents let their kids do mostly what they want to do. That doesn't mean they won't stop them hurting themselves, but in large measure it's a sort of modern empowerment type model that says the kids are naturally able to work it out for themselves, which appeals to some people and seems like nonsense to others. So this will be a close, well-nurtured family, but there is not a great deal of adult help. These are the parents who call their kids buddy, rather than the parents who say, I'm not your buddy, I'm your parent, and that's why I'm saying this. They want to be friends to their children, as opposed to being guides, mentors, and parents. Finally, there's the neglectful parent, who has low warmth because they don't have much of an emotional connection, and low control. They're basically not engaged, they're disengaged. And these types of parents will create children that feel abandoned. I've worked with a family where mum and dad were travelling all the time. Kids were put with nannies whenever they went overseas or travelled interstate for business, and no nanny was ever brought back in twice, because mum didn't want to create too big an association. She felt guilty about not being there, but at the same time she wanted to be involved and be involved in helping the business and also keeping an eye on her husband whenever he was travelling. So that ended up with a bunch of highly insecure children who all felt they were being abandoned every couple of months during their childhood, never got settled down. Very good example of where the parental style has a massive impact on the kids, which then plays out in the workplace many years later when they come to work in the family business. So if we find ourselves in this situation where we have parenting styles have created certain personalities and have caused children to either not mature normally or be immature or not take responsibility, lack empathy, all sorts of problems, and if that creates conflict, what do we do about it? Well, often the first thing to do is unpack the family narrative to work out how did you get to the place you're in now, so that we can understand why things are as they are. That makes it much easier to then say, right, if we can understand it, we can perhaps realise that it wasn't that parents didn't love us, it's just that they had to work like crazy to keep the business going so they could provide us with what they thought we needed. That in itself completely changes the narrative and can alter the family dynamic. So we unpack that whole family story, we recontextualize, we change sometimes the views of childhood that from an adult perspective people should have been able to modify for themselves, but they didn't because they were stuck with the emotional traumas that they've never been able to shed. And so they've got these juvenile views of what was going on during childhood rather than adult understanding. And that creates major problems and obviously massive resentments. We need to get everyone's perspective. We need to understand what did each person think was going on during those growing up years. Why did they act the way they acted? Why did they do what they did? If we can recontextualize, reframe that, and then perhaps apologise, make amends, acknowledge somebody's pain or hurt or dissatisfaction, and then make amends and then provide forgiveness, then basic counselling will say that is what allows people to let go of these damaging emotional traumas and just feel more comfortable in their own skin and in their relationships, which is pretty important if you're working with people in a family business. One of the things we often do is what's called the scapegoat ritual. This is the equivalent of the American Indians burying the hatchet. But a great many tribes, a great many social groups over the years have had different versions of the same thing. They look for a particular event or events and they say, that is what started everything that has followed. Now, everything that have followed may totally overshadow the original event. But if we're able to say none of that would have happened if we had understood more of what was going on at that time, if we can then find a way of representing all the angst, pouring it into a symbolic object of some sort, a hatchet for example, and in the conversations we're now having, we have apologies, we have acknowledgements, we have validations, and ultimately we have forgiveness. We then bury the hatchet, and you can do this physically with a toy hatchet, it still works. We can bury the hatchet, and that is a problem that we aren't saying didn't happen, but we're saying we're now released from the emotional trauma of not being able to let go. And so it no longer has power over the way we are feeling and acting about ourselves and about others. That is a very important process, and it's something we do with a lot of families. And it seems weird burying a rubber hatchet in the back garden of somewhere or other, but I can tell you it works. You may then need to provide further coaching and mentoring and reassurance to the individuals because they're not going to be cured overnight. But what we have done through this process is remove some of the age-old problems that were a consequence of emotional trauma suffered in the early growing up years, contributed to in large or in small part by parenting style, and we've now got that in a better perspective so it's not holding us back. If this has been of interest to you, please share it with others who you think might get benefit from it. Please give us a like, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for watching. Jonk, the Family Business Solutionist from Melbourne in Australia.